Welcome to the Pain-Free Athlete Podcast. I'm your host, Dana Jones. I am a certified personal trainer, and I'm here to help you achieve your fitness goals without pain. In each episode, I'll share tips and strategies that will help you stay safe and pain-free while you're working out. I'll also interview experts in the field of fitness and pain management. So if you're ready to learn how to stay active and pain-free, then subscribe to the Pain-Free Athlete Podcast today. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Pain-Free Athlete Podcast. I'm your host, Dana Jones, and today I am joined by my special guest, Charlyn. So, who are you and what are you doing here?
Well, thanks for having me, Dana. I'm glad you're interested in what I'm doing, and I really appreciate you inviting me here to tell your listeners and your viewers about what I'm doing. My name is Charlyn Huss, and I am the co-creator of something called CoreSpring and the creator of the CoreSpring method. I'm a longtime Pilates teacher. I was introduced to Pilates as a client many years ago, and I suffered from pain in my back from childhood, which was eventually diagnosed as scoliosis. And I had a huge imbalance in my back muscles, so I had sort of a hump on the right side of my back. I had artistic aspirations to be a classical actress, and I told no one. But I knew that there was restrictions that I couldn't do. I couldn't play certain parts if I had a body I couldn't control.
Hey.
And I didn't think of it in terms of control. I didn't even think of it in terms of pain-free. When I was about 11 or 12, I started playing around with exercises because I had been taught to swim. And I noticed that I felt better when I swam. But when I couldn't swim, I kind of just sort of degraded in the fall and winter into sort of this painful spiral. I couldn't really play normal sports, but I could play some games on the playground. I was the last person picked, for all the whole. I just was not. It was rough. It was rough. And I was really, really shy. And I think it's because pain really does change your personality. Because when I remember mentioning when I was about 8 or 9 to the kids on the playground, something about, well, doesn't that hurt your back? And they're like, what are you talking about? Hurt? What do you mean? What's wrong with you?
Right.
I kind of got this association that there was a negativity directed towards me if I was in pain.
So I'm going to stop you there or question you there. How did you because I'm always curious and I never know, I assume the reason why I had an association with pain at an early age is because my mother was always hurt for some reason. And so I think I just mimicked what I heard. Is that how did you pick up your association or, to the point that you're 8 years old and you're asking other kids, aren't you sore or, whatever?
I don't know. I think my grandmother was sort of Eurocentric. She was raised by people who were, I would say they're mid-Atlantic Americans. They were, I think my great-grandmother was born in Germany. I'm not sure. I really haven't checked that side of the genealogy. But she was very Eurocentric and very German in the way that she approached the body. And if you've never been to Europe, you don't really know that they really do view the body very differently than we do here. They don't have our history of puritanical Christianity and some other things that sort of that impose upon us a different view of the body. My grandmother was always on a diet. She always ate these things called figurines, which were like cardboard covered in chocolate. They were really horrible. And I was very fascinated by this constant dieting. She was like 5'0" and pretty thin as far as I could tell. But there was a bit of an obsession about body. My mother actually was anorexic at some when I was growing up. She had hypoglycemia. So I made a connection between mood and food, and I understood that and she was in a lot of pain, mostly emotional pain. I slept on a bed that was like this, and she feels bad to this day that my back is bad because that's pretty much what did it. I think I was sleeping in the bed that my father was conceived and born in. Okay, so it was one of those things. You get the mattress down the generations.
Right.
But anyway, so I have a kinesthetic wisdom, intelligence. And there's a really great book. It's called The 5 Frames of Mind. I forget the author right at this moment. But anyway, he talks about the 5 different kinds of intelligence. And I've seen now, and I started to realize that I saw things about the body and experienced things about my body that were different from other people. I thought everybody saw these things. I thought everybody felt these things, but they didn't. And so there was a sensitivity, if that helps to answer your question, that I say that to these kids on the playground and realize that they weren't in pain. And if they were, it was like, whatever. They weren't the nerd. But what this created in me was a kind of a discipline of stretching and moving my body. And books that were available to me. I'm from Los Angeles, So yoga was around. There was a yoga studio 2 blocks away. My mother went there a couple times. She wasn't interested, but she had books. There were magazines at the supermarket right at kids' eye level were these little books called Dell books, and they were about this big, and they had stretching and diet tips and all kinds of stuff. And I got these books with my allowance. They were 99 cents, and I was able to, put a beach towel on my bedroom floor and do these exercises. So as I grew, I basically became a curator or collector of different kinds of exercises. I wasn't really interested in exercise. I was interested in being pain-free, which of course what brings me here.
That is so interesting because I remember as a kid that I had, I was more of a teenager, but I was always into bodies. Like that perception of being fit and having no fat and, being able to see all your muscles. And so like when I was at the grocery store, I was always looking at muscle and fitness or shape or, whatever was around because that was what I was striving for. And then it wasn't until I was probably about 16, I got mono. And so I was home. And so while I was home, I got all those magazines. And then I was like, this is how I'm going to recover from mono. I was going to go ahead and I'm going to read all these magazines and learn how to make myself strong and, whatever. And it was pretty entertaining. So you're at this young age, you are connecting to your body in a very intellectual manner. And so now you start striving toward, how did you get into Pilates?
Well, I love to move. And, I was thinking about it when I was preparing, just before we came on about, pain-free athlete. I'm an athlete who couldn't be athletic. So for kind of a restriction. So I love to move. So I love to swim. I just happened to discover that movement made me feel better. So when I was in college, I studied ballet. Oh, my grandmother used to say things like, "You're not the most graceful kid in town." She'd say stuff like that to me. She was really helpful. Yeah. Don't get me started.
Just on the Eurocentric.
Right. But I remember, and when I was in gymnastics, I'll never forget, I was in the back trying to teach myself a handstand forward roll. And I looked at the front of the room and I realized that the teacher was really selecting out the best for the team. The rest of us were in the back. But I had this athlete inside me. So I got to college and I always loved to dance. I took dance classes and I took ballet. My ballet teacher said, "You really have a sense for these things." I said, "I do?" She goes, "Oh, yeah, you really do." And I was like, so that was my first clue that I had some coordination because I perceived myself as extremely uncoordinated. And so I just kept collecting and doing my own thing and not really going to many classes, but doing dance classes. And in dance class, you do you do center work, which is off the bar on the wall. And then you do floor work. And the floor work was familiar to me because of the Pilates work. I didn't understand. I didn't know it was Pilates at the time.
Okay.
But those exercises were familiar to me. Then long story short, I wanted to study acting. I wanted to be an actor, a stage actress, no less. So I did some pretty rigorous training in stage acting and combat, things like that. But I never performed. It was all just sort of an exercise for an acting class. And I was way too shy to pursue a career, but I still, in the back of my mind, thought I wanted to. Anyway, after college, I moved to France and I thought I was going to be there for 4 months. And I ended up staying 4 years.
Oh, wow.
Because there's this ability when you're in another culture to reinvent yourself. I didn't think of it that way at the time. And I have family in France. So it's not like I didn't know anyone. I had family there. I had friends there, people I'd gone to college with. And I enrolled in some courses. I was also told I'd never speak French, which within 3 weeks was ridiculous. But I was able to do more ballet classes. And then I was writing a dance column for a English-speaking newspaper there. And I interviewed a dancer. And she said, "Oh, sorry, I have to go to my plie session." And I said, "What's plie?" Being me, wanting to know everything about exercise and fitness. She said, "Oh, it's this machine." I said, "Do you think I can tag along?" And so I went with her and she worked with this woman, a much older woman, who basically screamed at her for an hour and worked her out on this, what was a homemade reformer.
Okay.
Time.
That sounds very painful.
And I was haunted by it. She looked like she was in pain the whole time. When she was done, she was like, "Oh, that was amazing." So I was like, what is that? But it wasn't like pain like you would think. It was more like challenge. That's really
Okay.
drew me to it. The word Pilates never came up. Now, what had happened, just to skip back a little bit, in a bookstore prior to that, about a year before that, I had found a book in an English-speaking bookstore called Shakespeare and Company, a book called Return to Life by Joseph Pilates. And it was all these floor exercises, which was my jam, right? Get on the floor, do these exercises. Because the word Pilates never came up in this particular interview or this session that I saw, I didn't know that there was a connection between that machine and this book that I had.
Oh, okay.
He doesn't mention those machines in his books, at least not to my knowledge at the time. And so that was my first connection to Pilates. When I came back to the States several years later, I looked around I saw Pilates. I'm like, oh, that's the guy's name. I went in, there was the machine, there was the connection, voila. And I started really trying to get into classes and start to really understand what this whole thing was about. And I got to get on that machine and really feel what this whole thing was about. And it was funny because I told them I had a little experience. They said, have you ever done it? I said, well, I've done this book, and I'm here to find out how to do these exercises correctly, right? And the woman assigned me a teacher, and the teacher said, well, that's not Pilates. This is Pilates. And she pointed to the reformer, and I said, but this is Mr. Pilates.
Right. This is his book.
and I work out at home. I like to do things on my own, and I'll work with you. Like I like this daily discipline. So, well, because she thought I had background, she put me on that reformer, and I was like upside down, turning around, spinning around. I recognize all the exercises now, but it was a really interesting challenge. But it was, again, I was like, what I had witnessed 3 years earlier, I was like, this is that feeling that I could see the gymnasts had, right? When they nailed us, when they were moving, this is what the dancers had, right? And I thought, this is going to be interesting. But it took several years for me to find more classes, to be able to afford Pilates. There weren't a lot of group classes at the time. I was still working with my book. So I kind of stuck to yoga because yoga was more accessible in Los Angeles.
Right.
And there were lots of yoga classes.
Yeah. And my recollection is that you weren't allowed to be on the reformer. Like people, like I know, well, I never heard of Pilates until I actually moved to California. And it's funny because when did he write his first book?
1934, he wrote To Your Health. And
yeah. So that's kind of crazy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and I never, and like I said, until I got here, and then I remember seeing the machines, but not a lot of studios had the machines. And then when I heard is that, or they would work only with private clients on the machines because you needed special training to actually be on.
What we talked about was what you're recalling were the classes.
Mm-hmm.
So, the reformer classes were few and far between. You needed at least 3 to 5 privates, and you needed the blessing of not just the teacher you were working with privately, but also the owner of the studio to make sure that you weren't liability. So that's how it went. That's how it went. And that changed about 10, 15 years ago. I started getting calls from people saying they wanted to come and do a class. And I said, well, you have to do this. This is what we do. They're like, well, that's weird because over at Pilates Plus, I can just get on the machine. And I was like, really? Because I thought at that time the Pilates Plus was Pilates.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't. It was fitness on a machine that looks like a Pilates machine. It was created, I think, by a man named Sebastian Legree, who now has Legree Fitness, and he did a lot of different iterations of the reformer. But yeah, so privately you could get on the reformer, and if you said you had experience, then they put you through the paces like she did with me. And I realized, okay, whoa, Nellie, I'm not going to say that again. Next time I go back somewhere else, I'm going to say I don't know anything and just do a beginner session.
Right.
But it was I think it was at least a year before I got back on a reformer, just because of budget.
Really?
I didn't have a lot of money. I just come back to the States. I was sort of getting my footing. I was working as a translator. I had studied acting in France. I had sort of pursued a career. So I was starting to do that, which led me to England ultimately a few years later. And England is where I really got into Pilates because, again, I'm in a different culture. I'm completely focused on school. I was at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art studying classical Shakespeare theater, and I ended up performing, on the West End and the whole nine. But I got to go into these Pilates studios and even these yoga studios and see what they were doing there. And I started to realize the connection between in the international community of the Pilates method, and that it was Western. It was a Western thing. And so what really transformed me was that I gave up Pilates. I gave up yoga to the exclusion of everything. And I just focused on Pilates when I came back from England for about, I don't know, maybe a summer, maybe longer. I can never remember exactly how long it was. All I know is that when I decided to go back to my favorite Saturday morning yoga class, I could stand on both feet without a problem. I always had problems with my right side. I was falling over. But again, I thought it was the imbalance. I had all these reasons why. But after doing Pilates for several months, really to the exclusion of everything else, I was like, this is interesting. Now, part of my background is psycholinguistics. I did get a degree in psychology. I don't think I mentioned that. That was my college degree. So I was very interested in the mind, the body. Again, I was interested in somatic psychology. There wasn't a lot going on at that time about that.
And now somatics are, well, they're definitely dipping into my world, into the pain-free world, because of the fact that, we're so disconnected from our bodies. But there are different types of somatics. And so I think when people discuss it, they're not quite sure what they're talking about. But is that polite enough?
Twice in my life. Once in psychology, just generally, and once in somatic psychology. And I do regret that I didn't do the somatic psychology PhD. A friend of mine said, I'm going to do it with me. And I chose not to do it. My parents had just died.
Hey, it's never too late.
The school moved out of California. Maybe I'll wind up going to Chicago and doing it there. But what happened was, pursuing a professional acting career, I needed to make a living. I did not want to interface with a computer as a translator. I had a great time as a translator and interpreter, but I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. I really knew I was supposed to do something with the body, and it wasn't massage. It was movement oriented. So I started to realize that this Pilates thing was interesting to me. I was voraciously reading everything about it. And I said earlier that he didn't write about his machines in his books. He did in To Your Health. He wrote about his Wunda chair.
Yes, I was like the chair.
He wrote about the chair, and he wrote about something called the V-bed, another genius idea that he had, which is probably another episode, Dana, talking about his bed and his concepts of sleep and movement and all that stuff. But I read everything I could. He didn't write a lot. He didn't speak on video because he had a thick German accent, and he was developing his method between World War I and World War II. So he realized that Germans weren't very popular. So he just tried to show his physique and talk about it this way. Anyway, it was hard to find teacher training programs. I did go to one or two here in LA, and I literally got to the threshold of the door and got the look from the reception like, can we help you? Looking you up and down. Like, I was interested in the teacher training. It's like, well, how much experience with Pilates do you have? Well, not too much. We'll come back when you have experience. So I felt it was the dancer culture in the
that sounds like the ballet.
It had nothing to do with what I was feeling and experiencing about this work. So through a series of happenstance connections, I did ultimately find my mentor. His name is Ray Alasakowicz. He founded Body Arts and Science International. I started working with him just at the time he opened this school. Everything was at On Center Conditioning, his studio at the time. So I was really on the cusp of what he was doing, developing his method. And he was what you'd call a second generation teacher. He trained first generation, all the people who worked with Joe. I am a second and third generation teacher because I trained with Rael. And I also trained with about 4-5 people who actually worked with Joseph Pilates because of this fantastic convention that we had that's pretty much gone now, called the Pilates Method Alliance. Every year, people from all around the world would talk about Pilates. And it just so happened I was very lucky that I started working with Rael and had met a couple that owned a Pilates studio, and I was able to work while I was studying. Now, I had the blessing from the studio in England saying she knows something about Pilates. That's how it worked. You didn't need a certificate. You were under the insurance of the studio or the gym or wherever you were working. So it was a very different time. And so while I was getting my training, I was teaching. But here's the thing. My background was always wellness. And so what resonated with me was Mr. Pilates said, the first requisite of happiness is physical fitness. And I understood this because of my personality shift. I'm clearly not a total introvert anymore. I'm really an introvert extrovert.
Nice.
But when you're not in pain, your personality does change, and working with people, and I work with a lot of older people, I understand this. Some of them can be super cranky, and I can create an art form to make them laugh, to get them to see the irony about what they're saying or something about it.
Right.
I'm very light because I'm really here to make a difference. And I zero in on each individual client very specifically. What do they need? So wellness precedes fitness. So over time, I started studying everything that I could. So I studied Alexander technique as an actor, which is about vocal resonance and the body as an instrument. All these things made perfect sense to me. I apply a lot of those concepts to the way I teach Pilates. I didn't want to work as a waitress as an actor. So I wanted to do something that meant something to me with my days. So I was teaching Pilates. At one time, I was teaching at 7 different places.
Wow.
Teaching classes, 2 or 3 classes a day. Sometimes I saw 8 clients a day. I was very working Pilates teacher, very working at the time. Lots of celebrity clients. I never took pictures with any of them because it just wasn't, you didn't have phones back then. It was like, that was a big deal. And I just never felt comfortable with that. I grew up in Los Angeles. I just never did that. But now it would be nice, to have the pictures, but whatever. But what happened was I studied all these different modalities because I was still struggling my goal was to be 100% pain free. So I was always looking for ways. So I used these specially designed balls created by someone named Yamana Zake, Yamana Body Rolling. I did a program with ballet, Pilates, and yoga. And I worked with people of all ages and stages. And eventually I realized there wasn't a studio that really would welcome everything that I was doing. I opened my own place in 2007 called Playhouse Pilates, Body Smarts, and Performing Arts. The Body Smarts part was all the Pilates and the body rolling and the foam roller, all these things. And then the Performing Arts were acting classes that I teach. I teach the Michael Chekhov method, which is very physical and imagination. It's not think about your dead parrot, play the scene. It's how do you organically create characters with your body and your imagination? And it's fun. It's a really fun way of doing acting. And having gone through all the classical training, which is very serious, rigorous, I came back to Los Angeles pretty depleted and wasn't having any fun anymore. So this method brought fun back to me. So Playhouse Pilates was a place where I could just sort of do the things that I love to do. And I was just really ahead of what is becoming a little bit more accepted now, a lot more accepted.
Oh, for sure.
And then I created a mastery program because I worked by myself for quite some time. I really honed in on the linguistics, the body, how to bypass some of the cues that I felt were getting in the way of my ability to have a client understand what I was trying to teach them. And my thing was, if they could get the movement, they'll get the benefit. Then they can progress. Then they can too be pain-free or closer to it. So I developed my own way of teaching Pilates. I created a mastery program and I had mastery students. And one of my mastery students is a kinesthetic guy too. He's very aware of his body. He's a full-time driver for UPS. And he was always
tough.
stretching. Yeah, that's brutal. He was always stretching and trying to figure out ways to go home, kind of fix it, and then get up the next day and go do it. Sorry for the noise. That's the plumber. And so we resonated. And I offered to everybody in my mastery program and all my teachers at my studio, come with me to these conventions with the Pilates Method Alliance. He was the only one who ever came. So he came and he'd been working with me at this small 800 square foot studio in South Pasadena. He got there and it was this international community. And I ran into at least 25 people that I knew within 2 hours. He was just like, oh, these people from all over the world. It was this whole world. So he came to 4 conferences with me. And he was always kind of figuring out things with straps and bands and stuff. And I was always encouraging him to improvise and figure stuff out. And then one day, coming back from one of these conferences after Mastery, he said, I want to talk to you about something after Mastery on Sunday. I said, okay. He said, we have springs on the machines with Pilates, but when we go to the mat, we have bands. But I want to have my own spring. Why can't I have my own spring? And I was like, my brain sort of went into like white fuzz. That kind of white noise, like, I have no reason. There's no reason why you can't have your own spring. But I was trying to get my head around what he was saying, because as a Pilates teacher, and I'm running into this with Pilates teachers that I'm showing CoreSpring, which is an independent spring that you hold in your hands and use with your hands and feet. With Pilates teachers, they're going through what I went through, which is that, no, but with springs, you got to hook it up somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So this was November 2019. We thought, and my Pilates studio for sale, I had a buyer. And I thought, and I could still run my mastery program out of there ostensibly. So I thought, I'm going to develop CoreSpring because I knew immediately that there was something interesting going on. And I started moving and working with it. And how we came up with it at that time is kind of interesting in and of itself. But just for the sake of time, I happened to have We tried a bunch of springs from the machines that I had, and they all felt weird. But I said, I've got these springs in this drawer from something I bought, and it was a used piece of equipment, and these springs were on it. And I said, well, you can keep those. They're like, well, we don't want them, so you take them. So I had put them in the drawer, and there were 2 of them. I took them out, and that really was the inspiration for CoreSpring. I don't know where these springs came from to this day. They were 20 years old, I'm sure. But we started using these with loops, just loops we pulled off of the Pilates equipment. And that was the beginning of CoreSpring, because what I realized immediately, I taught him an exercise. It's an exercise called SAW in Pilates right away. I said, let's do this. And I started doing that. And he's like, wait a minute. We just created this thing. How can you be teaching me, cueing me an exercise with it? And I said, because
that's how your brain works.
That's how my brain works. And I felt like, oh, there you are. It was just the sense of like, this is kind of what I have been looking for, not visually, but in my body.
Right.
There was something about taking that spring and expanding it and moving with it. And I was like, this is going to be fun. And we went into the pandemic lockdown. I lost my business, never sold it, had to close it. A lot of things happened to all of us around the world. But I had CoreSpring during that lockdown time. And it was a very playful, uplifting thing to interact with at that time in my life. And it took everything about what I believe. Wellness must precede fitness. They always show the after picture. You have to be thin. You have to be 27 years old. You have to weigh 98 pounds. I'm quoting my dad, by the way.
It's like, these are oddly specific.
He would sit there and a wine commercial would come on TV and he goes, I don't get it. You have to be 27 and 98 pounds to appreciate this. So, there's this feeling that you are left behind if you don't achieve a certain body type. And that just was never true. It wasn't true for me. It wasn't true for people I know. And it wasn't true for clients that I've had over the years. So this idea of core, the reason it's called CoreSpring is literally it named itself. Because when you play with it and you interact with it, it ignites your core in ways that are really interesting. And one of the things that Mr. Pilates said in an interview, I believe it was New York Magazine or the New York Times, he said, see these machines? I created these machines so the spring does the work so you can move.
Right.
And I remember I applied this to how I taught Pilates, and I was really into the spring. So recognizing the spring, it was like I felt the spring when I was working on the apparatus. But when I took that spring and I started moving with it, all of a sudden the volume was up 100 times. I could feel the spring. So I'll give you a great example because you asked me for some anecdotes.
Yeah, I was like, tell me what you're seeing, with clients in terms of using this.
Well, first of all, I'm going to tell you what happened to me during that time between November and March, November 9th, 2019. I was on my feet all day, running a business, teaching classes, teaching Pilates, and every morning, usually I pretty much had a kind of a tightness and a soreness in my low back, which I'd work out over the day. And then Joel, my co-creator, said, oh yeah, I've figured out this thing I'm doing with CoreSpring, and then I'm in the morning, I'm good to go. I said, what does that mean, good to go? He said, no pain. Magic eraser.
Okay.
Because he'd come home, be really exhausted from his day, get up the next morning, he would say, the previous day was still in my body.
Often.
Or with CoreSpring, he was able to do these things. And then, so we have a whole series of 5, 10, and 15-minute scenarios that we're creating called Good to Go. So that night he came up, he showed me what his good to go was. The next morning I woke up as usual because I was still teaching full time. Nothing had happened yet. And I said, I'm going to do the good to go. So I got on my living room floor and I did good to go before I went to the studio. And by the time I got to like the third movement, pain was gone.
Nice.
So that got my attention. And that, of course, I was always working with private clients during the lockdown. There were people who said, I'd rather die of COVID than be alone and not have Pilates and not do what I'm doing. So I never stopped seeing clients. I had a home studio. I was lucky enough to be able to bring my practice home. They were all early adapters of CoreSpring. Some of them got it right away. Some of them didn't, but most of them eventually started to understand what I was doing, especially when I put a sleeve to cover it. Because when it was just a bare spring, it was,
it's scary.
75% of my cues were keeping it out of your hair, So I said, it needs a sleeve, to Joel. And Joel said, why? I said, because of the hair. But he doesn't have any hair. So
right.
he's like, oh, yeah, there's that. But one of my longtime clients he had polio as a child. So he's had extreme challenges that are unimaginable to most of us. But at 70 plus, he's still walking and he's kept his weight down, and he does massage. He's been coming to me for Pilates for 20 years. He came into a mat class I was teaching, and he's been a really good client for me, and he's beta tested everything, but he wasn't so sure about CoreSpring because he uses his upper body all the time. So he never wanted to do upper body stuff. So I've been I see him periodically because he was very busy teaching at two universities. He's a very well-known, very influential person in Los Angeles. And but finally he's kind of semi-retired. He'll never retire, but he's semi-retired, not retired. So he comes in, and I'm doing some CoreSpring with him, and I'm doing what we call tandem CoreSpring, where I actually I have one end of the CoreSpring and the client has the other end, and I'm manually stretching and moving them. And he liked that. So we did that. But today, I just came from seeing him before I saw you. He had a real breakthrough because he needs to flex his hips. He needs to get upstairs, and he's got this brace, and he's going to get another brace. And I watched him walk up these 2 stairs at the place where I'm teaching right now. And he said, I said, what do you want to do today? He said, I want to talk about stairs. I said, well, yeah, I want to talk about stairs too. I said, what do you think's getting you up the stairs? My legs. Okay. Yeah. His legs are extremely compromised, right?
Right.
His lower leg is as big as my arm. Okay. So, and even I said, your legs propel to a certain degree, but there's a whole other thing that's going on that actually gets your leg to that propulsion. And that is hip flexion. And hip flexion does not depend on your legs. It doesn't need your leg as much as it needs your core and your psoas. It needs the corset, which is very much what we talk about in Pilates, and definitely with CoreSpring by extension, is that we think of the core as a three-dimensional experience of strength as opposed to abs. This is like when you said, well, we're going to do core work. People just go, oh God, it's so boring. And oh no, right. I hate it. I never do it well. It hurts my neck, blah, blah, blah. He's like, I want to do core work. And I said, well, great, because we're going to talk about hip flexion. So I had him, just flex his hips, and he could do one leg pretty well, but he couldn't, just lying there with his arms down by his sides and his knees bent. And then I gave him the CoreSpring to put in his hands and just do an opposite motion like that and flex. And it came right up. And he was like, wow, I can move.
That's cool.
And I was like, I said, so you feel how the CoreSpring is helping you? He goes, I can feel it. He goes, and I feel energy and like something I'm not familiar with in my legs. Like I feel something happen. Like when we started, I stretch him out. I do something with these specially designed balls. I do something called table work, and his legs were cold. And he was just walking.
No circulation.
Right. So I had him on a table that's at a slight slant that's bringing circulation to the legs while we're working together, but they were warmer. Right. But watching him lift his leg, flex his hip, because the core was working together. And this is something that I've said to clients for years. Your muscles, they're like an orchestra. They have the music in front of them of what they're supposed to be doing.
Right.
I'm supposed to be doing that. What happens is, and generally, ideally, as kids, we have this connection to our transverse abdominis. And the transverse abdominis is an interesting muscle because you can fire it anytime you want. That's where they're pulling the tummy in. And then it recruits the other muscles, the obliques and other muscles. But you can't really fire your obliques without doing anything. You can't just sit there and go, okay, you have to move. So the transverse, it's sort of what we call in the Pilates world the powerhouse, because it's part of the mind-body connection, belly button to spine. So when you have this transverse abdominis, it gets on board and you can control it. You can pull it up and in. You can connect it to the breath, and it could be an inhale or an exhale. All of a sudden, the other muscles in the body cue up. And that's why Pilates is so successful, even if you never hear anyone ever say this to you. If you've done Pilates the exercises themselves are like a broken clock. They're right twice a day. They're going to give you some of that empowering information. But when you know a little bit about what I'm saying, it makes all the difference.
Right.
Because then you're consciously participating in what's happening to the body. You're not just in the meat suit, you know. And now we know there's all this gut intelligence. And instead of getting, you know, a PhD in psychology, I ended up becoming a gut health specialist. And I believe, you know, we know now there are neurotransmitters in the gut. We know the gut is really
second brain.
It produces the serotonin. I mean, I've been doing gut health. Well, I got my certificate in gut health about 14 years ago. So I thank you very much. You too. Thank you, Marlo. So this whole gut brain thing, I think Pilates is successful too, because people do become more connected to this brain simply because they're focusing so much on it, not in a traditional abdominal exercise, but in a way that you're working your core really throughout a Pilates workout. But with CoreSpring, it's very intentional. It's very much discussed. You don't have to lift your head to do an abdominal exercise.
Mm-hmm.
This person, he does the 100, which is a arm pumping exercise, right? I said, do you want to do the 100, the CoreSpring 100? And he said, yeah. So I taught him the CoreSpring 100, which is basically a deconstructed 100.
Okay.
It's a deconstructed 100 that you can do with your head down or your head up. Because guess what? The spring is going to help you lift that head. So my challenge with Pilates as a client was to keep it out of my neck.
Yes.
Neck hurt, my traps hurt. I mean, hurt. When I started teaching it, I saw all this. So my method of teaching Pilates really dealt with that. And I really could get people to that, advance their Pilates repertoire, because they weren't focused on discomfort in the neck.
Right. Because it does become distracting.
It does become distracting, and I figured it out. Consequently, they don't teach the 100 in most reformer Pilates classes right now. Nowadays, it's been taken off the table, and that started 15 years ago when the classes came along. So with CoreSpring, you keep your head down, you're lying down, but it takes from my Pilates background, which is that you're on your back, you're on your tummy, you're on your side, you're standing, you're kneeling. So you're working through all planes of motion. So you're not just on your back, just doing it ab work. So CoreSpring definitely takes its cue. It isn't, if I may say, an offspring of Pilates.
That's awesome. Charlyn, thank you so much for everything and telling us your story. How can people get in touch with you or learn more about CoreSpring and possibly get a visual of it so that is it only exclusive to your area?
You can go to CoreSpring.com. You will see a picture of me with a CoreSpring, so you'll know what it looks like. It's a very humble apparatus, and we do have 2 patents on it.
Okay.
Believe it or not. I'm getting my video page together, and we're launching our app. We were supposed to launch it in January, but because of the fires here in California, I've got a little bit derailed. I was evacuated at one point. So, you know, it's been kind of interesting. Crazy. I'm one of the lucky ones. I know people who aren't. They're alive, but they've lost everything. So I'm really grateful. But it did kind of slow down the process, and we're working on that. So it'll be coming out February 2025.
Okay.
Where you can, when you purchase a CoreSpring, you get a 7-day or 7-part challenge. You can do it consecutively, and that will teach you how to work with the booklet that the CoreSpring comes with. And I'd like to offer your listeners a discount code.
Thank you so much.
So we'll probably use the code pain-free.
Oh, awesome.
25% off, not off any sale price that you'll see, but off the original price, you'll get 25%.
That's great.
And
Thank you so much.
That's a great way to start.
That's awesome. Any parting words of wisdom for our listeners?
I really think it's never too late. If you're going to start something new, in the great words of Nike, just do it. Of course, I think that CoreSpring, and I do think Pilates too. I think CoreSpring for a beginner is a fantastic place to start. It's not limited to Pilates. If you like weight training, if you're an athlete, it really is a great tune-up, tune-in wellness apparatus. And then it can also up level your fitness. So I think just start to move. And if direct spring resistance technology can help you, I'm here to help you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dana.